One thing that a lot of people don't know about the game development world is pretty much 99% of all game designers are frustrated authors. And they have wanted to write a book for their entire lives and they haven't done it. And writing a book is not an easy thing. Personally, I have started 10 different books and I have never finished any of them. That's a reality. I have written stories for games. I've written dozens and dozens of stories for games. One of the games that I made actually had a movie made out of it. I actually was one of the people that wrote the story for the original Far Cry. There was a movie. Got 12% on Rotten Tomatoes, by the way, if you go check out the Far Cry movie. It was a U-Bowl film. But I can actually say I've written a story that has been made into a movie. That thing has happened, but I've never actually managed to finish writing a book. Sad. But you will find that most designers fall into this sort of frustrated author thing that we pretty much all share, and it comes out in our games. And one of the real challenges in writing a video game is to take that author part of you that wants to tell a very specific story, and sort of shove him down and don't write the story for the player. The player wants to write his story. And that challenge of figuring out the difference between game writing and book writing. And book writing, it's very specific. These characters are going to do precisely what I tell them to do. They're going to go precisely where I want them to go. They're going to think and say precisely the things I want them to think and say. But in a game, we don't have that, because there's this other person, there's this player, and this player wants to go places and do things, and he wants to make decisions, and he wants the decisions that he makes to be meaningful. And we fight against the urge to say, no, that's not what you're supposed to do, because the good story that I wrote is over here, and you can't go over there. If I told you that you could go here or you could go there, I gotta make both of those places interesting. For me, I think one of the really interesting examples of story versus game is you go play World of Warcraft, because people will talk about the story and the lore. When you talk about a game with extremely deep lore, obviously there's an entire universe that Blizzard has made around the Warcraft franchise that spans a number of games. Now it includes Hearthstone and World of Warcraft. It includes all the old Warcraft games. There's a whole world that Blizzard has made over the last 20 years around the Warcraft universe. But when you play World of Warcraft, pretty much you keep going through the same goddamn story, and you really can't tell it. No, I don't want to do that thing. You really can't make choices in Warcraft that make meaningful difference, because you're in a massive multiplayer online game, and the choices that you make affect other people's choices, and blah blah blah. There's a whole world of things like that. But it's an interesting study in probably one of the largest I guess long-term game lores that were ever made. I mean, there are other games that have big lore. If you look at Star Wars or Star Trek or these other things where they brought the lore in from somewhere else, Lord of the Rings, there are games based on that. But if we're looking at a game that started as a game and didn't start as another intellectual property, I struggle to think of something. I guess Final Fantasy or Zelda might fall into the same category of a really long history and a lot of lore. And it's a struggle. And so this brings me to what I've been doing lately, which is writing the lore for Last Regiment. And one of the things that we said when we began this project was we were going to take the world building seriously. We're going to take the lore seriously. We're going to take the story seriously. And that's a very easy thing to say. Oh yeah, we're going to have a story. We're going to care about it. But there's a deeper thing that you have to do. And anyone who's been involved in putting together a detailed story, one of the things that you have to do before you can write your specific story, if you're building a fantasy world, is you have to actually create the world that this story is going to take place in. Now, I did start almost 9 months ago by putting together a very skeleton outline of here's kind of the main beats of the story that I want to tell, and here's some very basic ideas about the universe that we're going to tell it in. But it was all very skeletal. And so since then, I've been taking notes and kind of making thoughts about how I think the world should be, and who the characters are and what the history is and blah, blah, blah. But it's all been sort of scattered. And we kind of been running into a problem recently with the studio where some of the artists have been kicking back to me and saying, what is this thing I'm drawing? This doesn't make sense to me. Why are there these constructs and these undead things? Why do we have people with muskets and people with swords? They didn't get it. They were like, I can draw this, but it doesn't make sense to me. And I realized that, all of this story was in my head, but I had not conveyed it to the team. And so the team didn't really know what the hell they were making in terms of the art. And that was problematic. And I said, what we need to do right now is we need to sit down and we need to convey all of this stuff that's in my head to the artists so that they know what the hell it is they're drawing. And so I sat down and I did what I called the first story dump. And the first story dump was the ancient history of this world. Sort of my version of Tolkien's Silmarillion. It was the old stories that maybe might show up in our lore in a couple, mentioned passages or something like that. Just some very basic understanding of the universe. And that was not much. It was 5 pages of, so-and-so begat so-and-so, and here's where the things went. I'm not going to, and we'll talk for a minute while I'm not telling you the details. So I dumped that on them, and they were like, ooh, this is nice. And then yesterday I dumped on them about 17 more pages of serious lore, which is recent history. And it's the recent history of what is called in our game world the Reconquest. And it's the time when the old world is going back to a world that they had colonized in the past. The colonization had failed, they had retreated, and there had been a dark period for a couple hundred years where there was no trade between these two people across a very large ocean. And the Reconquest is the beginning of the rediscovery and the reconquest of this continent. And our story takes place in that reconquest. And that's all I'm going to tell you about it right now. It's very, very broad details, but it kind of gives you the setting for what we're doing. And so I released to the team, here is 17 pages of closely, very detailed history, who attacked who and where the battles were, and, how what wars were fought. And because we're dealing with this period of history, and again, going back to what we're trying to do different in this game, instead of going with a more medieval history, we're going with a much more modern sort of Age of Enlightenment era history. I looked to those colonial histories of England and Holland, and I looked to the wars in Europe in the 1600s and the 1700s, and how incredibly detailed that is, and how many, if you were to sit down and really ask yourself who fought who in Europe and why from 1600 to 1700, there are whole college courses based around one country of that, much less the entirety of Europe. And that doesn't even take in what's happening in Southeast Asia or et cetera during that period. So when we're trying to sort of replicate that feel, obviously our history gets kind of complex and kind of confusing. Now, admittedly, it is way simpler than anything that that actually happened in Europe or something like that. It is a very, very simplified version with a lot fewer players and a lot fewer kings and queens and battles and wars, because I want to have it be something that I can actually get people to understand. If I were to do something as complex as the totality of European history, I would be writing it until I died, right? So that's not something that we can do. And so, yeah, that's what I've been up to lately. Should Boomzap share this? Is that something that people want? Is it people that they don't want? And I'm very torn about this, and I don't have a good answer to what to do, because part of me wants to share some of this because we're trying to do open development, and we're trying to keep people involved in what we're doing and that sort of thing. So there's part of me that says, yeah, we should share this, and I would be interesting. Like we said, we have people that write books and people who are interested in writing and people who are interested in lore and fantasy that might be interested in this. The other side of it is that's the game, and I don't want to spoil it. I don't want to give away too much of what's happening, because I want people to have that sense of exploration and that sense of discovery when they play the game, and I don't want it all to just be sitting there on the internet before we ever make the game. So there's kind of a, I don't know what the best thing to do there is. And I think where I'm coming down on it right now is that I'm not going to share it anytime soon. And the reason I'm not going to share it anytime soon, largely, is because I want the freedom to change it, right? I mean, we're still in the process of writing it. Literally, I'm the only person in the entire studio who's read all of it at this point. I think, there's a couple people on the team that have read some of it, or they kind of skimmed it and they're like, yeah, okay, I'm getting back to this because it's pretty dense reading. And it is very dense reading. It's not, it's not written to be fiction. It's written to be a history. It reads like a history book. So I think once everyone's had a chance to read it and responded in the team, and once I've gone through and done changes to it, and once we've started writing the real story for the actual game itself, then we can get into, maybe we can release some of these details sort of as teasers. Maybe we can put out some teaser trailers and that sort of thing. I think doing it that way, maybe putting together some, here's a screenshot of one of the factions and just a little tiny blurb about the history of one of those factions. That kind of stuff might make good marketing materials without spoiling the game. And so that's something that I think we'll talk about. So there's that. There was a question asked by Ben, one of our artists, when I gave him this story information, and the question was, where's our characters? And it was interesting because I wrote this whole history of the Reconquest, and obviously there are characters in the game, there are heroes in the game. You guys have seen them when we play our games. There's Tristan, the guy on the horse, and there's Carl, and there's Captain Hollythorn and all these other characters. And he's like, none of these characters appear in your history, and there's a reason for that, and this I will talk about, which is when you're putting together a world, you go through the first step, which is what I've been doing right now. What is the large history of the world? Then you go through the second step, and the second step is detailing out the facets of the world. What is the technology like? What is the magic like? How does the magic work? Do they have ships? What kind of ships? Do they have firearms? What about money? Well, how much, how's their trade work? Language. What languages do they speak? What are the interactions with the races? How do they feel about races? There's a whole sort of bunch of data that I'm compiling right now, which will be the third story dump, which is the world. So you've got story dump 1, which is here's the basic history of the world. Here's what's happened, and here's how we got where we are right now. Then you've got 2, which is here's some detailed answers about questions that people are going to ask about, does this guy have access to a flintlock pistol or a musket? What do these people have? That's the next step. And then the final step is, what is the actual story of the characters who are in this game? What are they doing? Where are they going? Who do they meet? And if you and you should kind of know that bit. You should kind of know that bit before you start anything, because you want to be building something that will lend itself to that thing that you're going to build at the end. But by the time you've gone back to the beginning and you've done this whole thing, that thing's going to change, because you're going to have new ideas and new characters and new places and things like that. The question is, what is the scale of your story? If I go back to Callasia, which, to be honest, we didn't spend much time on the story, the scale of that story was epic. You were a general or a king, and you were taking over whole hunks of the world. It was a big world conquest game. Axis and Allies level, I'm in charge of Germany and we're going to take over all of Europe. And that's fine. You can make games like that. That's a large scale, epic scope game where, you're the person saving the whole world. Last Regiment is not an epic scope game. By design, I wanted to keep everything much smaller. The characters are smaller. There's this huge thing, this reconquest happening. There's this amazing thing happening around you, and you are part of it. And you are an important part of it. I mean, you're not an unimportant character, but your choices are probably not going to be the things that are going to change the entire, world history. You're not going to save nations. You're not going to create your own kingdoms. That's not the story that we're telling. We're telling a smaller scale story about specific characters going through a journey within this environment that we're building. And so because of that, when I'm putting together the big history of the world, the characters that we're going to be interacting with don't really show up. And if you look at the scale of the actual characters that are going to be involved in the game, they're captains and lieutenants. They're people who command as the name of the game implies. Wait, I got to learn how to point. Wait, I can do this. As the name of the game implies, you're controlling a regiment, not an army, and you know, it's on that scale. So it's a far more personal story than you know, a larger epic story would be. And I like that. I like that because it gives you, you know, one of the problems is when you're talking about a big, huge, epic story, there's not a lot of scope for talking about this person's relationship to this person, or, you know, human level contact. You kind of have to put that aside and say, well, you know, we're really worried about the entirety of Europe here. We're not really interested in whether or not Napoleon took a lover. That's not, we don't give a shit about that. This is a much smaller personal story because I think people like those personal stories and they want to care about these characters, and I want to pull it down to that level. So that's the answer to Ben's question of why do none of our characters show up in your story? There's that.